Part 6, the Krell withdrawal took 3 weeks. Their ships descended from orbit to pick up troops and equipment from their remaining bases. They moved systematically, pulling out from remote positions first and consolidating at major spaceports. The human resistance watched carefully, weapons ready. Nobody trusted that this was really over. Some groups argued they should attack during the withdrawal, hit the Krell while they were vulnerable. But most leaders, including Jake Morrison, counseled patience. Let them leave. Do not give them a reason to stay and fight harder. There were incidents. Some Krell units, angry and humiliated, lashed out at civilians as they retreated. Resistance groups responded by attacking those units, protecting the people. A few small battles erupted, but overall the withdrawal proceeded. Day by day, the alien presence on Earth diminished. Their warships lifted off, carrying defeated soldiers back to whatever world they came from. Jake stood on that same Montana hillside where he had watched the invasion begin 4 months earlier. Now he watched the last Krell ship in this region lift off, climbing through the atmosphere until it was just a bright point of light that eventually vanished. Amy Carson stood beside him. Neither spoke for a long time. The moment felt too big for words. Finally, Amy broke the silence. She asked what they should do now. The Krell were gone, but Earth was a mess. Infrastructure was damaged. Governments had collapsed. Communication networks were still down. Supply chains were broken. Millions of people needed help. Jake looked at the group of fighters gathered around them. These people had spent 4 months learning to work together without orders. Maybe that skill would be useful for rebuilding too. He proposed they keep the network intact, not as a military force but as an organization to help communities recover. They had resources, weapons for security, and most importantly, they had proven they could coordinate large efforts without bureaucracy. The Northern Alliance could become something new, a way for people to work together and rebuild without waiting for governments to reform and start issuing orders. The idea spread quickly through the resistance networks. All over Earth, fighters were having similar conversations. They had learned to operate independently and cooperate voluntarily. Why stop now? Why go back to the old systems that had failed when the crisis came? Maybe there was a better way forward. Sam Parker's coalition in Japan became one of the first to transform. They organized work teams to repair roads and bridges. They established security patrols to protect against looters and criminals. They set up distribution networks for food and medicine. The Japanese government was slowly reforming, but in the meantime, Sam's people kept things running. And they did it without anyone being officially in charge. Tasks got done because people saw what needed doing and did it. The model worked so well that communities in other regions started requesting their help. Sam sent small groups of experienced fighters to advise and train others. They shared what they had learned about organizing without hierarchy, making decisions by consensus, and getting things done through cooperation rather than command. The lessons learned fighting the Krell turned out to be useful for rebuilding civilization. Nicole Hayes and Kate Bishop faced a different challenge in Australia. The outback had become home to thousands of refugees who fled the cities during the invasion. These people needed food, water, shelter, and medical care. Nicole and Kate converted their military network into a humanitarian one. The same hidden supply caches that once held weapons now stored medicine and food. The same communication system that coordinated attacks now coordinated relief efforts. Kate organized teams to dig wells and set up water purification systems. Nicole used her knowledge of aircraft to get old planes running again, creating a supply chain that could reach remote communities. Former soldiers became teachers, medics, and construction workers. The transition was not always smooth. Some fighters struggled to shift from warrior to helper, but most adapted just as they had adapted to guerrilla warfare. Colonel Marcus Webb worked on a larger scale. His tank units became security forces protecting reconstruction projects. But Webb insisted they operate differently than traditional military or police. His people were armed and trained, but they answered to the communities they protected. If a town did not want their presence, they left. If people had complaints about their behavior, those complaints were taken seriously and addressed. Webb created what he called defense cooperatives. Communities would organize their own security with help and training from experienced fighters. No central authority, no unified command. Just networks of people committed to protecting each other and working together. It was messy and sometimes inefficient, but it was also flexible and responsive to local needs. General Paul Henderson emerged from the Pentagon ruins with a radical proposal. He suggested that Earth should not rebuild the old military structure. The invasion had proven that centralized command was a vulnerability. Instead, he proposed a new model based on what the resistance had done. Autonomous units that could operate independently but chose to cooperate. No rigid hierarchy. No single point of failure. Many traditional military leaders opposed this idea. They argued that discipline and chain of command were essential for effective defense. Henderson countered that the chain of command had been cut on day one of the invasion, and yet Earth had defended itself successfully. Maybe the old model was not as essential as everyone thought. Maybe there was wisdom in what the resistance had accidentally created. The debate continued for months. Governments slowly reformed and started trying to reassert control. Some embraced the new networked approach. Others tried to return to traditional structures. Earth became a patchwork of different systems, all experimenting with ways to organize society after the invasion. Jake Morrison's Northern Alliance became a model that many communities studied. They had over 3,000 people now, spread across 5 states. They operated collectively owned farms, workshops, and clinics. They maintained armed security teams but also invested heavily in infrastructure and education. Anyone could join. Anyone could leave. Decisions were made by discussion and consensus. It was not perfect. Arguments happened. Mistakes were made. But it worked. One day, a government official visited Jake's main community. She represented the reformed federal government and wanted to know if the alliance would accept federal authority and funding. Jake asked what accepting federal authority would mean. The official explained there would be regulations, oversight, and accountability to Washington. Jake politely declined. He said they had learned to operate without orders from above. They would cooperate with the government, share resources, coordinate on common problems, but they would not subordinate themselves to a command structure again. The official was frustrated but could not really argue. The alliance was not doing anything illegal. They were helping people and maintaining peace. They were successful by every measure. If the government wanted to shut them down, it would have to use force against people who had just saved the planet. That would not be politically popular. 6 months after the Krell left, representatives from resistance groups all over Earth gathered for a meeting. Nobody had organized it officially. People just started showing up at a neutral location in Switzerland. Over 500 delegates came, representing thousands of resistance cells from every continent. They met in an old conference center and spent 2 weeks talking about the future. Jake was there. So were Sam Parker, Nicole Hayes, Kate Bishop, and Marcus Webb. Also present were leaders from groups in Africa, South America, Europe, and Asia. People who had never met but had fought the same enemy and learned the same lessons. The conversations were intense. Everyone had ideas about how to move forward. Some wanted to formalize the resistance networks into new government structures. Others wanted to keep everything loose and voluntary. Most fell somewhere in between. What emerged was not a plan but a set of principles. A recognition that the old ways had failed, that centralized control was vulnerable, that people working together voluntarily could accomplish amazing things, that hierarchy was often unnecessary and sometimes harmful, that humans could organize themselves without someone at the top giving orders. Not everyone agreed with these principles. Plenty of people wanted to return to traditional governments and militaries, but the resistance networks existed and were proving themselves effective. They provided an alternative that people could choose. Over time, some communities embraced the networked approach while others returned to older models. Earth became an experiment in different forms of organization. Years later, when historians studied the Krell invasion, they focused on one key point. The aliens had correctly identified Earth's military command structure as the critical vulnerability. By destroying it, they thought they would win easily, but they misunderstood what military command actually did for humans. It was not what made humans effective fighters. It was just how they had organized effective fighters for convenience. When the command structure broke, the fighters remained. And those fighters proved they did not need someone telling them what to do. They needed weapons, information, and the freedom to adapt. Given those things, they became more dangerous than any organized army. The Krell. Part 5. By the 4th month, the Krell had lost more soldiers on Earth than in their previous 10 conquests combined. The numbers were staggering and embarrassing. Nearly 12,000 dead, hundreds of vehicles destroyed, aircraft losses that would take years to replace. And they still did not control more than a fraction of the planet. The War Master knew he was facing a decision that no Krell commander had faced in centuries. He might have to retreat. Jake Morrison's network had merged with several others to form what people were calling the Northern Alliance. Nobody officially named it that. The name just emerged from messages and conversations. About 2,000 fighters now cooperated loosely across Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. They still had no central command, but they shared intelligence and resources freely. When one group needed help, others would respond. The Alliance pulled off an operation that became famous among resistance groups worldwide. They attacked 3 different Krell bases simultaneously, each over 100 miles apart. The attacks were coordinated through messenger chains, with the timing set weeks in advance. No electronics, no radios, just handwritten notes and trusted people carrying messages on foot or horseback. All 3 attacks succeeded. The Krell simply could not respond to multiple threats at once when spread across such a large area. They would send reinforcements to one base while the other 2 fell. By the time they realized the scope of the operation, all 3 bases were destroyed and the human fighters had vanished. The Krell lost over 300 soldiers in one night. They also lost credibility among their own troops, who were starting to doubt they could ever secure this planet. Jake stood in the ruins of one of the captured bases, watching as people sort through the supplies they had seized. Amy was beside him with a clipboard making an inventory. Weapons, ammunition, food, medical supplies, even some Krell technology they might be able to reverse engineer. It was a fortune in resources. But more importantly, it was proof that they were winning. A young fighter approached Jake. She had been a college student before the invasion. Now she led a squad of 20 people. She asked Jake what the long-term plan was. Were they just going to keep raiding bases forever? Did they have a strategy for actually driving the Krell off Earth? Jake was honest. He said he did not know. They were making this up as they went. But every day they survived was a victory. Every day the Krell lost resources was a step closer to them giving up. In Japan, Sam Parker's coalition had grown to over 400 fighters. They had become so effective that the Krell had pulled out of the entire region. It was not an official withdrawal. The Krell just stopped patrolling there. They abandoned their bases and retreated to more defensible positions. The Japanese countryside was effectively free. Sam's people had won without fighting a final battle. They had just made the occupation too expensive to maintain. Sam gathered his commanders, which now included leaders from a dozen different backgrounds. They discussed what to do with their success. Some wanted to pursue the Krell and keep attacking. Others argued they should focus on helping civilians rebuild. Sam proposed a middle path. They would maintain military readiness but also start helping communities recover. They would be both warriors and builders. The coalition started clearing roads, repairing infrastructure, and helping farmers plant crops. But they did it while staying organized and armed. They created a model that other resistance groups began copying. You could rebuild and resist at the same time. You could help people and hurt the enemy. The 2 goals were not contradictory. Nicole Hayes and Kate Bishop had expanded their operations across most of Australia. Their anti-aircraft network now included over 60 hidden weapon positions and 300 fighters. But they had also started doing something unexpected. They were capturing Krell pilots alive when possible. The aliens would eject from damaged aircraft, and Nicole's people would grab them before Krell rescue teams arrived. At first, they did it just to prevent the pilots from being recovered and returned to combat. But then Kate had an idea. What if they tried to communicate with them? What if they could learn about Krell weaknesses, strategies, and morale? Most of the captured pilots refused to talk. But a few were willing. And what they said was interesting. The Krell were tired. They were scared. They were confused about why humans would not surrender. Their military doctrine had no answer for an enemy that fought harder after their command structure was destroyed. Some of the pilots admitted they thought Earth was cursed. Others said the Krell leadership was incompetent for not withdrawing. The prisoners revealed something important. The Krell were not just losing militarily, they were losing psychologically. Colonel Marcus Webb's tank groups were operating in what used to be heavily occupied territory. But the Krell had pulled back so much that Webb found himself driving through abandoned bases and empty checkpoints. The aliens had given up trying to hold everything. They were now concentrated in a few heavily fortified positions, mainly around cities and spaceports. Webb saw an opportunity. If the Krell were consolidating, that meant supply lines connecting their remaining bases. Long supply lines that had to cross open country. Perfect targets for his mobile tank units. He started hitting convoys that connected Krell's strongholds. The aliens tried protecting the convoys with more guards and air support. Webb adapted by attacking at night or in bad weather when Krell aircraft could not fly effectively. One convoy battle became legendary. Webb's group encountered a Krell supply column protected by heavy armor and gunships. Normally, he would have avoided such a strong force. But this convoy was carrying something critical. Intelligence from Amy Carson's network indicated it was transporting fuel cells needed to keep the Krell ships operational. Without those fuel cells, several Krell warships in orbit would have to leave or risk being stranded. Webb coordinated with other resistance groups in the area. They created a massive ambush using every resource available. Tanks, improvised rockets captured Krell weapons, and over 200 infantry fighters. The battle lasted 3 hours and was brutal. The humans lost 30 people and 2 tanks, but they destroyed the entire convoy. Every fuel cell was captured or destroyed. 2 weeks later, 3 Krell warships left orbit, presumably to refuel elsewhere. They never came back. Around the world, similar stories were unfolding. In Brazil, resistance groups had made the Amazon so dangerous for Krell forces that the aliens abandoned the entire region. In Russia, fighters were using the vast distances and harsh weather to grind down Krell units. In India, resistance cells were using dense urban environments to set up ambushes that Krell technology could not effectively counter. In Mexico, former cartel members had joined with military veterans to create some of the most ruthless guerrilla units the Krell had encountered. The Krell War Master finally had to report to the home fleet. He transmitted a detailed analysis of the situation. The humans had no unified command, yet their resistance was coordinated. They had no communication networks, yet they shared information effectively. They had no central strategy, yet every group seemed to know what tactics worked best. The occupation was failing. Continuing it would require triple the current troop commitment and would still likely fail. The home fleet's response took 2 days to arrive. When it came, it was brief. The War Master was authorized to begin withdrawal procedures. The conquest of Earth was canceled. It was the first time in Krell history that they had abandoned an invasion. Back in Montana, Jake Morrison received a message through the network. Multiple resistance groups had spotted Krell forces pulling out of bases and heading toward their ships. At first, people thought it was a trick, a tactical repositioning before a major offensive. But as reports came in from all over the planet, a different picture emerged. The Krell were leaving. Not from one region, but everywhere. They were retreating. Amy Carson could not believe it. They had won, not through a climactic battle or brilliant strategy. They had won through persistence, through adaptation, through thousands of small victories that added up to something the Krell could not overcome. They had won by refusing to lose. Jake gathered his people and shared the news. Some cheered, some cried, some just sat in stunned silence. They had survived. Earth had survived, not because they followed orders or maintained a command structure. They survived because when the structure broke, the people did not break. They adapted, they improvised, they kept fighting in 1,000 different ways. The Krell were leaving, but the victory felt different than anyone expected. It was not clean or dramatic. It was messy and exhausting. But it was real. Earth's armies had been broken, but Earth's warriors had saved the world. Part 4. 2 months into the occupation, the Krell made a significant change in strategy. They started building fortified bases instead of trying to patrol everywhere. They created supply corridors protected by heavy weapons and constant surveillance. They pulled back from rural areas and concentrated on holding cities and key infrastructure. On paper, it looked like a smart adjustment. In reality, it was an admission that they had lost control of most of Earth. Jake Morrison's resistance cell had grown again. They now worked with a network of 11 different groups spread across Montana and Idaho. About 400 fighters total, though they rarely gathered in one place. They communicated through a system of dead drops and runners, messages hidden in hollow trees, notes buried in marked locations. Information passed hand to hand through trusted intermediaries. The Krell withdrawal from rural areas gave the resistance room to breathe. They established more permanent camps hidden deep in forests and mountains. They started stockpiling supplies raided from abandoned military depots and captured Krell convoys. They even began training new recruits, civilians who wanted to fight but had no military experience. Former soldiers taught them the basics: how to shoot, how to move quietly, how to stay alive. Amy Carson took charge of intelligence gathering. She created a network of observers who watched Krell movements and reported back. Some were resistance fighters. Others were ordinary citizens who lived in occupied cities and passed information through secret channels. Amy compiled reports, looked for patterns, and identified targets. Her work made every operation more effective because they knew exactly where to hit and when. One of their biggest operations came in late November. Amy's intelligence revealed that a major Krell supply convoy would be traveling through a mountain pass. The convoy carried food, fuel, and ammunition intended for 3 different bases. It was heavily guarded with 60 soldiers and 6 armored vehicles. Normally, Jake would have considered it too dangerous to attack, but Amy's information showed the convoy would be most vulnerable at a specific point where the road narrowed between steep cliffs. Jake brought together fighters from 5 different groups. Nearly 80 people for one operation. They spent 3 days preparing. They placed explosives along the road. They positioned sharpshooters on the cliffs above. They set up fallback positions in case things went wrong. Everyone knew their job. Everyone understood the plan. The attack went perfectly. The lead vehicle triggered the first explosion, blocking the road ahead. The rear vehicle hit another explosive, blocking retreat. The convoy was trapped. Fighters on the cliffs opened fire. The Krell soldiers tried to return fire, but they were exposed and surrounded. The battle lasted 20 minutes. When it was over, the entire convoy was destroyed. The humans captured enough supplies to last months. They lost only 2 fighters, both wounded but alive. Across the Pacific, Sam Parker's coalition had evolved into something unique. 200 fighters from 8 different nations, operating with a fluidity that baffled military analysts who later studied their tactics. They had no formal command structure. Leadership rotated based on the situation. If they were planning an attack, the most experienced combat veteran would lead. If they were navigating difficult terrain, someone who knew the area would guide. If they were treating wounded, the medics took charge. This flexibility made them incredibly effective. The Krell could never predict what they would do because they never did the same thing twice. Sometimes they would attack aggressively. Sometimes they would set elaborate traps. Sometimes they would avoid contact entirely and just gather intelligence. Every operation was different because different people were leading based on different strengths. Their greatest achievement came when they liberated an entire town. The Krell had occupied a small coastal city, using it as a logistics hub. About 200 alien soldiers garrisoned there, controlling the port and using it to bring in supplies from orbit. Sam's people spent 2 weeks preparing. They infiltrated the city in small groups disguised as refugees. They hid weapons in abandoned buildings. They mapped every Krell position. The attack began at dawn with simultaneous strikes on the Krell barracks, command center, and communication arrays. The aliens were caught completely off guard. They had grown complacent, assuming the humans would never dare attack a fortified position. By noon, the city was free. The Krell survivors retreated to their ships. Sam's people held the city for 3 days, evacuated most of the civilian population, then destroyed the port facilities and vanished before Krell reinforcements arrived. In Australia, Nicole Hayes and Kate Bishop had become legends among the resistance. Their anti-aircraft network had expanded to cover thousands of square miles. They had shot down 37 Krell aircraft and damaged dozens more. The Krell were forced to fly higher and faster over the outback, which reduced their ability to support ground troops. Entire regions became no-fly zones where Krell pilots refused to go, but Nicole and Kate were not satisfied with just shooting down aircraft. They realized the Krell relied heavily on air support for their ground operations. Without it, their troops were vulnerable. So the 2 women started coordinating with ground resistance groups. They would shoot down aircraft, forcing the Krell to ground their flights. Then ground teams would attack while the enemy had no air cover. One operation took out an entire Krell base. Nicole's network shot down 2 aircraft in the morning, creating a sensor gap in the Krell detection grid. Ground fighters used that gap to approach the base undetected. They assaulted at sunset, when the Krell expected air support but could not get it because their aircraft were grounded. The base fell in hours. Over 100 Krell soldiers were killed or captured. The humans took weapons, equipment, and vehicles before burning everything they could not carry. Colonel Marcus Webb's tank groups had become a nightmare for Krell logistics. They would appear out of nowhere, destroy a supply depot or convoy, and disappear before the enemy could respond. The Krell started calling them ghost tanks. They would deploy surveillance to watch supply routes, but Webb's people had learned to avoid those routes. They traveled cross-country. Through terrain the Krell assumed tanks could not navigate. Webb also pioneered a new tactic. His group started attacking Krell bases not to capture them, but to force the enemy to waste resources defending them. They would shell a base from long range, then retreat. The Krell would reinforce the base, pulling troops from other areas. Then another resistance group would attack the weakened positions. It was coordination without communication, strategy without orders. The Krell were hemorrhaging resources. Every day brought more attacks, more losses, more failures. They had come to Earth expecting an easy conquest. They found themselves in a grinding war of attrition against an enemy that refused to die. Their casualties were mounting. Their supply lines were unreliable. Their troops were exhausted and afraid. The Krell War Master convened an emergency meeting with his commanders. They discussed options. They could request more troops from the home fleet, but that would mean admitting failure. They could increase the brutality of the occupation, but that would only create more resistance. They could offer negotiations, but the humans had no central authority to negotiate with. Every option was bad. Meanwhile, back on that Montana hillside, Jake Morrison sat with Amy Carson watching the sunset. They had just received word through the network that resistance groups were succeeding all over Earth. In Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in South America. Everywhere humans were fighting back. Everywhere the Krell were struggling. Amy asked Jake if he ever imagined things would go this way. 2 months ago, they were 15 scared people running from a destroyed base. Now they were part of a global resistance that was actually hurting the enemy. Jake admitted he had not imagined it. He had just focused on surviving one day at a time. But somehow, millions of people making that same choice had created something powerful. They did not need a supreme commander telling them what to do. They did not need a master strategy handed down from above. Every group figured out what worked for them and did it. And somehow all those independent efforts added up to something the Krell could not defeat. It was chaos, but it was effective chaos. It was disorder, but it was purposeful disorder. The Krell had broken Earth's armies, but they had freed Earth's warriors. And those warriors were proving impossible to stop. Part 3, 3 weeks after the invasion began, the Krell started noticing problems. Small problems at first. A patrol that did not return. A supply truck that disappeared. A communication relay that went offline. These things happened in any occupation. But the problems kept growing. Every day brought more missing patrols. More destroyed equipment. More mysterious attacks that came from nowhere. Jake Morrison's group had evolved from 15 confused sailors into something more dangerous. They had linked up with 3 other military groups and 2 civilian militias. Together, they numbered almost 80 fighters. Nobody was officially in charge, but people listened to Jake because his ideas worked. He had studied the Krell patterns for 3 weeks. He knew when they patrolled. He knew which routes they used. He knew their weaknesses. The Krell relied on technology. They had sensors and drones and advanced weapons. But all that technology needed power and maintenance. Jake's group started targeting their supply lines. They would hide explosives on roads the Krell used. Simple bombs made from materials bought at hardware stores before the invasion. Nothing fancy. Just enough to destroy a supply truck or damage a troop transport. The first successful ambush happened on a rainy Tuesday. Jake's people hit a Krell convoy carrying fuel and ammunition. They set off the explosives just as the lead vehicle passed, then opened fire from hidden positions. The fight lasted less than 5 minutes. 3 Krell vehicles destroyed, maybe 20 alien soldiers killed. The humans disappeared into the forest before reinforcements arrived. 0 human casualties. Amy Carson had become the group's planner. She was good at seeing patterns and predicting what the enemy would do next. After the convoy attack, she knew the Krell would respond by increasing patrols in the area. So she suggested they move their camp 30 miles south and lay low for a week. Jake agreed. They packed up and relocated. Sure enough, Krell forces swarmed the area they had left behind, searching for the attackers who were no longer there. In Japan, Sam Parker's international coalition had grown to over 200 fighters. Word had spread about the farm where soldiers were gathering. People came from destroyed bases all over the region: Japanese, Korean, American, even some Australian and British troops who had been stationed nearby. Nobody cared about nationality anymore. They cared about survival and resistance. The language barrier had actually become an advantage. It forced them to communicate simply and clearly. When planning an operation, they could not rely on complex verbal orders. Everything had to be shown, demonstrated, and confirmed. This made their plans more solid. Everyone understood their role because they had to really understand it. There was no room for confusion. Sam's group specialized in hit-and-run attacks. They would strike a Krell position, cause damage, and vanish before the enemy could respond. They moved fast and traveled light. The Krell expected resistance groups to have bases and supply depots. Sam's people had neither. They carried everything they needed. They slept wherever they stopped. They were like ghosts that materialized to attack and then dissolved back into the countryside. One of their biggest successes came when they destroyed a Krell command post. The aliens had set up a headquarters in an abandoned factory. It was well guarded and seemed impossible to assault. Sam's people studied it for days. Then a Korean soldier noticed the factory's old drainage system. The tunnels were too small for Krell soldiers who were larger than humans. But they were perfect for humans. 12 fighters crawled through those tunnels in the middle of the night. They emerged inside the factory and planted explosives throughout the building. The blast killed over 50 Krell soldiers and destroyed communications equipment that covered 100 square miles. Sam's group was 10 miles away before the Krell even understood what happened. Captain Nicole Hayes had become an expert in something nobody trained her for. She was now a specialist in improvised anti-aircraft warfare. The Krell controlled the skies, but Nicole was making that control expensive. Working with Kate Bishop's ground troops and several local farmers, she had created a network of hidden weapon positions across the Australian outback. They used old anti-aircraft guns pulled from museums. They modified farming equipment into mobile missile launchers. They even rigged up systems where groups of soldiers would fire rockets simultaneously at low-flying Krell aircraft. It was crude and dangerous, but it worked. In 3 weeks, they had shot down 9 Krell fighters and 2 transport ships. The key was mobility. They never fired from the same position twice. After each attack, they would pack up the weapons and move miles away. The Krell would bomb the attack site, destroying nothing but empty desert. Meanwhile, Nicole and her people were already setting up at a new location, preparing the next ambush. Colonel Marcus Webb's armored groups had discovered their own way to fight. Tanks were too visible to hide and too slow to run, but they were perfect for lightning strikes. Webb's 4 groups would coordinate attacks on different targets at the same time. The Krell would detect one group and send forces to intercept them. While the enemy was focused on that threat, the other 3 groups would attack supply depots or troop concentrations elsewhere. The coordination was done through motorcycle messengers. Low-tech and slow, but impossible for the Krell to intercept or track. Webb would send riders between groups carrying handwritten orders and intelligence reports. It took hours instead of seconds, but it worked. The Krell never knew where the next tank attack would come from. Webb's people also learned to use the terrain. They would hide tanks in barns or under highway overpasses. They would cover them with dirt and vegetation. From the air, they were invisible. Then they would burst out, fire a devastating barrage at Krell positions, and retreat back into hiding before enemy aircraft could respond. All over Earth, similar stories were playing out. In South America, former Special Forces soldiers were training indigenous tribes to fight the Krell using jungle warfare tactics. In Africa, resistance groups were using the vast deserts to their advantage, attacking and disappearing into terrain the Krell found impossible to navigate. In Europe, fighters were turning ancient castles and medieval fortifications into strongpoints that Krell technology struggled to crack. The Krell commanders were confused and frustrated. On every other world, destroying the military command structure had led to quick surrender. But humans were not surrendering. They were getting more organized and more effective. How could an enemy with no central command be coordinating attacks across an entire planet? How could forces with no communication system be working together so well? What the Krell did not understand was that humans did not need orders to know what needed to be done. Every resistance group independently came to the same conclusions. Attack supply lines, Avoid direct confrontation. Hit fast and disappear. Use the terrain. Stay mobile. These were not ordered strategies. They were obvious strategies to anyone who thought about the problem. The Krell also failed to understand human communication. They had blocked electronic systems, but humans had been sharing information for thousands of years before electronics existed. Messengers on foot, handwritten notes, smoke signals, even graffiti spray-painted on walls to warn other groups about Krell movements. The information flowed slowly, but it flowed. By the end of week 3, the Krell had lost over 4,000 soldiers. They had lost hundreds of vehicles and dozens of aircraft. They controlled the major cities, but the countryside belonged to the humans. Their supply lines were under constant attack. Their troops were demoralized and paranoid. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every quiet street could be an ambush. The Krell War Master reviewed the reports with growing concern. This was not how invasions were supposed to go. The human military was broken, yet somehow the humans were winning. He ordered more troops deployed and more aggressive tactics. He did not yet realize that more troops and aggression would not solve his problem. Jake Morrison sat around a campfire with his people, sharing a meal of canned food and wild game. Someone asked him if he thought they could actually win this war. Jake looked around at the tired, determined faces in the firelight. He said he did not know about winning, but he knew they were not losing. And as long as they kept fighting, kept adapting, kept refusing to quit, they had a chance. That was enough for now. Part 2. The second day brought fire from the sky. Krell warships attacked every major military base they had identified. Missiles streaked down from orbit, turning command centers into craters. Air Force bases erupted in flames. Naval yards collapsed into rubble. The aliens were thorough and efficient. They destroyed everything that looked like organized military infrastructure. Jake Morrison and his small group watched from a hillside 20 miles away, as their base disappeared in a series of explosions. Amy Carson sat beside him, her face blank with shock. They had saved 15 lives by leaving when they did. Everyone who stayed behind was gone now. One of the younger sailors started crying. An older sergeant put his hand on the kid's shoulder and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The group had found an old warehouse to hide in. It had been abandoned for years, surrounded by forest and far from any major roads. Jake spread a paper map on the dusty floor. Paper maps were all they had now. Every digital system was useless. He marked the location of their base, or where their base used to be. Then he marked nearby towns, roads, and potential supply sources. They had food for maybe a week, ammunition for a few firefights. No plan beyond surviving the next few days. Amy asked the question everyone was thinking. What were they supposed to do now? They were 15 people with rifles and pistols facing an enemy that could destroy buildings from space. Jake did not have a good answer. He said they would do what soldiers always did. They would adapt to the situation. They would find ways to fight back. It sounded brave when he said it, but inside he felt lost. Across the ocean in Japan, Lieutenant Sam Parker was dealing with his own crisis. His Marine unit had been conducting joint exercises with Japanese and South Korean forces when the Krell arrived. Now they were all trapped together on a base that no longer existed. The barracks were ruins. The command building was a smoking hole in the ground, but the people had survived by being out in the training fields when the attack came. Sam found himself in charge of 43 soldiers from 3 different countries. Most of the Japanese and Korean soldiers spoke limited English. Sam spoke no Japanese or Korean. They communicated with hand signals and simple words. Despite the language barrier, they all understood one thing. They needed to work together or they would die separately. A Japanese sergeant named Kenji had an idea. His family owned a farm in the countryside about 50 miles away. It was remote and small. The Krell would have no reason to target it. They could go there, hide, and plan their next move. Sam agreed immediately. They gathered weapons and supplies from the wreckage and started marching. 43 soldiers moving through the countryside, trying to stay invisible. In Australia, Captain Nicole Hayes was having the worst day of her career. Her fighter jet had been shot down by a Krell attack craft. She ejected at the last second and parachuted into the outback. The landing was rough. She hurt her ankle and spent an hour limping through the desert before a group of Australian soldiers found her. They were a squad from the army base that had been destroyed that morning. Like everyone else, they were now refugees with guns. The squad leader was a tough woman named Kate Bishop. She had been a sergeant for 15 years and had served in 3 different conflicts. Kate took one look at Nicole's flight suit and pilot wings and asked if she knew anything about ground combat. Nicole admitted she did not. She was a pilot. Her job was flying, not fighting on foot. Kate smiled and said that was okay. Nicole could teach them about air combat, and they would teach her about staying alive on the ground. Back in America, Colonel Marcus Webb made a decision that went against everything he had been taught. His armored division was intact. The tanks were functional. The soldiers were ready, but they had no orders and no mission. The base they had been stationed at was now a crater. Marcus gathered his officers and told them they were breaking the division into smaller groups. Each group would operate independently. They would spread out across the region and look for ways to fight the Krell. The officers were shocked. Break up the division. That was insane. Their strength was in their unity, their coordination, their combined firepower. Marcus explained that the Krell knew how to fight divisions and armies. They had sensors that could track large formations. They had weapons designed to destroy mass troops. But small groups moving independently might slip under their notice. It was their only chance. Not everyone agreed. Some officers refused to split up. They took their tanks and headed toward what they hoped were friendly lines. Marcus let them go. He did not have the authority to stop them anymore. He took the people who trusted him, about 60 soldiers and 12 tanks, and divided them into 4 groups. Each group went a different direction with orders to survive and harass the enemy however they could. General Henderson was no longer commanding anything. The Pentagon had been hit hard. Half the building was destroyed. Communications were still impossible. But Henderson was not ready to give up. He gathered the surviving officers and personnel and told them something radical. The old military was dead. The chain of command was broken. From now on, they would operate as independent cells. Anyone with military training was authorized to act on their own judgment. There would be no more waiting for orders. Some of the older officers could not accept this. They argued that without discipline and structure, they were just armed mobs. Henderson understood their concern, but he also understood the reality. The structure was gone. They could either adapt or die. He told everyone they were released from their oath to follow the chain of command. Instead, their only duty was to resist the enemy in any way possible. Then he dismissed them. Some left to find their families. Others stayed to fight. By the end of the second day, the Krell believed the battle was essentially over. They had destroyed the human military infrastructure. They had shattered the command system. Now it was just a matter of hunting down the scattered remnants. They began landing troops on the surface. Thousands of Krell soldiers deployed to occupy major cities and secure strategic locations. But something strange was already happening. The scattered human forces were not surrendering. They were not fleeing. They were digging in. They were hiding. They were watching. And in some places, they were already preparing to strike back. Jake Morrison's group made contact with a local militia. Just civilians with hunting rifles who wanted to defend their homes. Jake shared what military supplies they had. In return, the militia told them about Krell movements in the area. It was a small thing, but it was a start. Sam Parker's international group reached the farm in Japan. They set up a hidden camp and began scouting the surrounding territory. They spotted a Krell supply convoy on the second night. They were not strong enough to attack it yet, but they noted the route and timing. Information was a weapon too. Nicole Hayes learned how to move quietly through the bush. Kate Bishop taught her how to set up an ambush. The Australian soldiers were impressed by how quickly the pilot adapted. She might not have ground combat training, but she had the mind of a warrior. That was enough. The Krell had broken Earth's armies just as they planned, but they had not broken Earth's soldiers. And those soldiers were beginning to realize something important. They did not need orders to fight. They did not need a command structure to resist. They just needed courage, creativity, and a willingness to adapt. The real war was about to begin. Part 1. The sky over Washington turned dark at exactly 9 in the morning. Jake Morrison was drinking coffee in his apartment when every screen in the city switched to the same image. Giant ships floated above Earth, blocking out the sun in every major city across the planet. The ships were massive, each one larger than any building humans had ever constructed. They just appeared there, as if they had always been part of the sky. Jake grabbed his phone to call his commanding officer at the base, but the line was dead. He tried the emergency military channel on his radio. Nothing but static. Every communication system that the military used had stopped working in an instant. He ran to his car and drove toward the naval base where he worked, but the streets were already filling with confused people. Nobody knew what was happening. Nobody could reach anyone in charge. At the Pentagon, General Paul Henderson stood in the command center watching his entire network collapse. Every satellite connection died. Every secure line went silent. Every computer system that linked the military together simply stopped responding. Within minutes, he had no way to contact the forces stationed overseas. He could not reach the ships at sea. He could not communicate with the Air Force bases scattered across the country. The entire military structure that took decades to build had been severed in less than an hour. The aliens called themselves the Krell. They had done this 47 times before on 47 different worlds. Their strategy was simple and effective. First, they cut off all military communications. Second, they waited for the chaos. Third, they destroyed whatever command center still tried to coordinate a response. Fourth, they watched as the broken military fell apart and surrendered. It had worked every single time. On the aircraft carrier stationed in the Pacific Ocean, Captain Lisa Morgan gathered her officers in the briefing room. They had no contact with command. They had no orders. They had no idea what was happening beyond their own eyes. Through the windows, they could see 3 Krell ships hovering over the water in the distance. Lisa made a decision that would have gotten her court-martialed under normal circumstances. She told her crew they would operate independently. They would make their own choices. They would defend themselves and anyone else they could reach. Halfway around the world in Germany, Colonel Marcus Webb faced the same situation. His armored division had been preparing for a training exercise when the communications died. Now he stood in a field surrounded by tanks and soldiers, completely isolated from the rest of the military. Marcus was a man who had followed orders his entire life. He had risen through the ranks by being disciplined and obedient. But now there were no orders to follow. He gathered his officers and told them something he never thought he would say. They were on their own now. They would have to figure things out themselves. The Krell watched from their ships and saw exactly what they expected. The human military was fracturing. Units were becoming isolated. The chain of command was breaking. Within days, they predicted the humans would be helpless. They had seen it happen on every other world. Cut off the head, and the body dies. Remove the commanders, and the soldiers become lost. But the Krell had never encountered humans before. They did not understand that humans had been fighting wars for thousands of years before they invented radios or satellites. They did not know that human soldiers had survived and won battles throughout history, even when separated from their commanders. They did not realize that breaking the military structure would not break the military spirit. Jake Morrison finally made it to the naval base after 3 hours of driving through panicked streets. When he arrived, he found chaos. Officers were shouting contradicting orders. Enlisted personnel were standing around waiting for someone to tell them what to do. Equipment sat unused because nobody had authorization to deploy it. Jake saw immediately that the formal structure was actually making things worse. People were so used to following the chain of command that they were paralyzed without it. He found Lieutenant Amy Carson in the communications room, still trying to reach headquarters. She looked exhausted and frustrated. Jake told her to stop. He said they needed to accept that help was not coming. They needed to start making decisions themselves. Amy looked at him like he was crazy. They were just junior officers. They did not have the authority to make major decisions. Jake pointed out the window at the Krell ship visible on the horizon. He said authority did not matter anymore. Survival mattered. They gathered a group of about 30 personnel who were willing to listen. Jake proposed they leave the base. It would be a target soon. They should take weapons, supplies, and vehicles and head inland where they could hide and plan their next move. Half the group refused. They said they would wait for orders. They said abandoning their post was desertion. The other half agreed with Jake. Within an hour, 15 people left the base in 3 vehicles, carrying everything they could pack. By the end of the first day, The Krell had mapped every major military installation on Earth. They prepared their second phase. They would strike these installations simultaneously, destroying any remaining ability for humans to coordinate a defense. They expected this would break the remaining resistance. After that, occupation would be simple. General Henderson spent the day trying to establish any kind of communication network. He sent runners between buildings. He tried old radio frequencies that were not part of the military system. Nothing worked. The Krell jamming was complete. By evening, he realized something important. The military as an organization might be finished, but the military as a collection of trained individuals was still intact. He started thinking differently. Maybe they did not need a unified command. Maybe they needed the opposite. Captain Lisa Morgan's carrier was attacked that night. Krell fighters came in fast and destroyed the ship's weapon systems before retreating. It was a demonstration of power, a message. Lisa knew they would come back to finish the job. She made another unauthorized decision. She ordered the crew to abandon ship. They would take the smaller boats and rafts and scatter. They would head to different coastlines and continue fighting from there. Some officers protested. The ship was their home. Their duty was to stay with it. Lisa told them their duty was to survive and keep fighting. The ship was just metal. As the first day ended, the Krell were satisfied. The human military was breaking exactly as predicted. What they did not see was that each broken piece was beginning to think for itself. Each separated unit was starting to adapt. Each isolated group of soldiers was remembering that humans had been warriors long before they had fancy communication systems. The invasion had just begun, and already the Krell had made their first mistake. They thought breaking Earth's armies would defeat Earth's soldiers. They were about to learn the difference.